doing, my friend? Good. Technically, we're turning to evening, everyone, so I'll say good evening. If you could make your way to your seats and get settled. Hello and welcome to Politics and Prose at Union Market. I am Julia with the events department, and we're very happy to be welcoming authors and bookworms of all ages back into our spaces this spring. If you're interested in our full calendar of events, feel free to visit politics-prose.com/events for those. Before we begin this evening, please take a moment to check whether your cell phones are silenced. Go ahead and do that. It's good to do it even if you think you've done it, because it's the times you think you've done it when you have not. And also note the exits behind you in the case of emergency. Additionally, you received note cards on your way in if you wanted to write down your Q&A questions. I'll be collecting those a little bit later as we go to audience Q&A in the last portion of our discussion. If you purchased a book with your ticket, you should have grabbed that on the way in. If not, no worries, please collect it on your way out. If you want to purchase a copy of Derek Baxter's In Pursuit of Jefferson that is signed by the author after the discussion this evening, we're going to have those behind the register for you to purchase. And lastly, to help with our phenomenal events staff, as you exit this evening, please take responsibility for the chair that you are sitting in. When we leave today, please stand, fold that up, and place it against the wall to your right. Again, against the wall to your right. That'll help everyone get out here safely. So without further ado, I'm very excited to welcome Derek Baxter celebrating the publication of In Pursuit of Jefferson, which is at once the story of a life-changing trip through Europe, an unflinching look at a founding father, and a moving personal journey. With rich historical detail, a sense of humor, and boundless heart, author Derek Baxter explores how we can be better moving forward only by first looking back. Derek Baxter graduated from the University of Virginia with a degree in history. He is currently an attorney who lives in Fairfax, Virginia. After years of research, Derek made 9 separate trips abroad on Jefferson's trail. You can follow his adventures with Thomas Jefferson at www.jeffersontravels.com, and of course, grab the book. We are so fortunate to have the author with us this afternoon, so please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Derek Baxter. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Julia. Thank you, everyone who's come out here and braved the snow for our book launch, and for all of the people watching on the live stream, and also this will be filmed on C-SPAN, so I'm sure you'll be appropriately rowdy for C-SPAN. So this book is about a time that's little known in Jefferson's history in his life. It's about a travel guide that he wrote in 1788. So a lot of us know about the Jefferson who wrote the Declaration of Independence, earlier when he was 33, or about President Jefferson when he was an older man and, had the Louisiana Purchase, had all these great accomplishments. But this is about the middle-aged Jefferson. So it's a lesser-known time of his life. And Jefferson in the 1780s. It was a very dark time in his life, too. In 1781, Jefferson, he was the governor of Virginia. He had been governor for 2 years, and he wasn't a very effective governor during the Revolution, during the war. The British overran the state. He was almost captured, and he was bitterly criticized because of all this. People accused him of cowardice, and Jefferson swore off politics. He said he was going to retire to his home, his farm, and his family, and nothing would separate him from them anymore. But then the very next year, in 1782, his wife died, Martha Jefferson. They had spent 10 years of uncheckered happiness, as he put it, together. And she passed away after a very difficult childbirth. And Jefferson, he wrote that he was in a stupor, almost as dead to the world as now his wife was. And he even hinted at suicide in letters. So Jefferson, he's left politics. His kind of life is crumbling around him. And it was at this time he decided to accept an appointment to Paris to be an ambassador. He had turned this down twice before, but now he thought really there was nothing keeping him back in Virginia anymore. And it was when he went to France then in 1784 that he really rediscovered himself. Julia, this is a picture of Jefferson looking a little happier. He's already taken up the French dress, the style of dress in Paris. He got to experience the arts, the museums, sculpture, music, wine. You know, he just fell in love with Paris. He went to the intellectual salons of the day, and he really got new ideas. He was ready to return to America after 5 years and begin, of course, what turned into be, his rise in politics. And so it was really travel that did this for Jefferson. It was living in France. It was taking these 3 great trips he took across the continent and to England. And by the time he was done with all this, towards the end of his stay in 1788, there were 2 young Americans who showed up in Paris. So these were sons of acquaintances of him back home. And they asked themselves, who better? They want to take this big trip across Europe. Who better to ask for advice on travel than the ambassador, Mr. Jefferson? And so they asked him for some tips. And Jefferson, being, of course, the ultimate overachiever, he didn't just give them a little bit of advice. He sketched out this entire itinerary. So this map of everywhere to go across the old world. And he included we can move on to the next map too. He included some thoughts on England as well. But he didn't want these 2 young men to be just tourists having a good time. He wanted to challenge them as well. He thought that through travel they could really learn about Europe and they could find important ideas to bring back home, but also cautionary tales and things to avoid. So he set out what he called objects of attention. So he had 8 different objects of attention that he wanted these travelers to engage with. And so I'm going to test you here for a second to see how well you know Thomas Jefferson. So I wanted so of all these objects, some were more important than others. What do you think he thought the subject here was most worth great attention for an American traveler? So if you can't see, the subjects are agriculture, mechanical arts, manufactures, landscape gardens, architecture, painting and statuary, politics, and the royal courts. So any takers? Architecture, yes. Who is that? Okay, so you have now won. There's a prize, too. You've won this beautiful, suitable for framing map of Jefferson's journey. So we can give that to you afterwards. But there's a couple other questions, too. Which of these subjects do you think he basically said was so expensive that it would be useless and preposterous for an American to learn about them?
Royal court.
That's a good guess. But he did want people to learn about courts. So any other takers? What's that? Politics. No, not politics. Yes.
Number 2?
No, not number 2 either.
Painting and statuary.
Painting and statuary. Yes, I think we've got a photo finish. Painting and statuary. He just thought painting. He just couldn't imagine Americans becoming like great painters at that time. And finally, which of these subjects do you think he said would show the weakest and the worst part of mankind?
Royal court.
That's definitely royal courts. Who's our winner there? Okay. Well. So anyway, stop by afterwards and get your map. And just we'll stay on this slide because I want to talk to you about one other subject that didn't even make this list, but was very important during his travels, which was wine, which is kind of interesting because Jefferson was a very serious guy, and you might think, wine, is that serious a topic? But he listed all these wines and hints, and it was clearly meant a lot to him. So I'm going to read a page from the book about Jefferson and wine. Jefferson's travels through southern France, as well as Italy and Germany, form part of his quest for the perfect bottle of wine. This wasn't just so he could lay out the best table in America, although he would do that too. Until independence, Americans had drunk only rough, overly sweet Madeira, forced on them by the English and their restrictive trade policies. Now the wines of France were open to American importers. But which ones were the best? There were no printed guides. Jefferson would have to make discoveries for himself. The grapes he selected might even be grown back in America. Jefferson worried that the fastest growing drink in popularity back home was corn whiskey. He didn't want his beloved yeoman farmers going on benders. He imagined them sipping fine yet affordable wines by the fire at night, reading Virgil in the original Latin, and discussing democracy. So Jefferson rambled through the vineyards, as he put it, talking to vintners, observing winemaking, and finding deals. He recorded how women plucked snails off the grapes and how men grafted vines. He bought vine cuttings to experiment with in his garden and bottles to sample at home. These were the happiest days of his life, he wrote later. After his trip, Jefferson would use his rankings of Bordeaux to guide his purchases, which he made directly with the winery whenever possible. Middlemen inevitably cheated the consumer, he wrote. He'd travel home from France with 363 bottles in tow, mostly white Bordeaux, and that was just for his immediate use. The rest of his vast wine collection was shipped in crates. So as I was, I came across this guide, I guess, to fast forward this story. He wrote this in 1788. These two young men followed it, but then it was basically sitting in the Library of Congress ever since. Occasionally his biographers would mention it, but not too much was really done about it. And about a decade ago, I guess I was looking for a challenge. I was looking for something else in my life. So I, like Jefferson, I was from Virginia, was pushing 40 myself, kind of going through a bit of a midlife crisis, and I came across this guide, and it really spoke to me. I particularly liked the author of it. Jefferson was one of my heroes growing up in Virginia. I saw him as this Renaissance man, this kind of genius founder who could do it all. So here was my hero basically setting out a challenge for me, setting out this guide. And I asked myself, what would happen if I just took this guide and went out there and did the itinerary? What would this lead to? But it also left me with a lot of questions. I realized, I wasn't ready to just quit my job and go out there for a year, far too many responsibilities for that. So I was going to take the travel in pieces and do it in segments. But I still had questions about just what would I discover out there on the road and how would this look in practice, and would I really be able to connect with Jefferson? And then particularly wine. I just told you about how wine was important to Jefferson. And I knew that if I wanted to go and do these travels myself, I'd have to go to Bordeaux. Bordeaux, the most exclusive wine region in the world. It's this place that Jefferson wrote all about. But you can't just waltz into Bordeaux and go to a vineyard and do a tasting. It's very restricted. And so that's when I came across, also on the internet, a means to go to Bordeaux. And there was a catch involved, though. Well, first of all, here is me looking up to Jefferson, quite literally. I don't know, the bobblehead got in there somehow. But here I am with my wife, Liana, in Bordeaux, because we found out that there is a way in. There's a hack. You can get to Bordeaux, and you can go to these fancy wineries. You just have to run a marathon to do so. So they have a marathon every year. People dress up in costume. The chateau open their doors, and they let you in, but they make you drink wine as you're running. So here we are. This is a decade ago. I was thinking, do I really want to do this? And I realized in 2012, they're going to run this marathon, and the theme was history. So everybody was going to be dressed in a historical costume. So if I ever wanted to run a marathon dressed as Jefferson, this was the time. So off we went. But again, this was going to be a challenge. I wasn't sure how it was going to work out. Liana and I wanted to do this first run, this first trip, and see then if it made sense to continue our trip. So we went to Bordeaux, dressed up. We didn't train too much for the marathon, but we did practice our drinking. But I'm going to read you another passage from the book. It's towards the end of the marathon. It's a hot day. It's we're really I'm thinking about a lot of things. I'm thinking about Jefferson and thinking about the wine and also these two men who followed the trip. One of them actually wrote to Jefferson from Bordeaux wanting advice. Basically, he was torn. Should he stay in Europe or should he go back home? He was, he too wanted advice from his mentor. But I think most of all, at the end of this marathon, we're just thinking about surviving it. By now, the small sips of Bordeaux no longer dull the throbbing in our knees or the blistering on our feet. And even the mild, whiny buzz has disappeared. Allez, Liana, call out the spectators, who look concerned. Her name is on her running bib, but I wonder why she's garnering such attention. Then I see that she's as bright red as a nice Cabernet Sauvignon. Despite all the pageantry and wine, it's still a marathon, our first, and doubts about this whole expedition creep in. How would it bode for any plans of following hints if we fail on this inaugural leg? We walk briskly. I know we're north of 6 hours into the race, closing in on the 7-hour limit, because the marathon had a limit of 7 hours, and there were 3 Frenchmen called the sweepers running along at that pace. If you fell behind them, you're basically kicked out of the race. A tent with the flag proclaiming kilometer 38 is a welcome sight. We're on the home stretch, and it's time for the most famous stop on the journey, a table piled high with heaps of mottled oysters. A man with a proud white mustache and sun-browned arms shucks them at a snail's pace. I drink white Sauterne poured from a plastic water bottle. It tastes different from everything we've had before, tropical, like lychees and passion fruit. Jefferson loved the sweet wine so much that he would order it his whole life, sending bottles to George Washington as a present. The lush Sauterne almost puts me in a trance. If only I could lie down, stop running, and drink some more, preferably listening to sitar music. I reach my hand out for seconds. Liana shouts to me from the edge of the tent. I can't hear her, but manage a Gallic shrug, smile weakly, and take another swig. Liana looks upset, as if she'd eaten a bad oyster, and points dramatically at a hill, as if to say, J'accuse. I follow her finger. High, cresting a distant hilltop, 100 meters ahead of us, run the 3 sweepers. Behind them, a gaggle of runners practically cling to the trio's capes, begging for penance. The sweepers and their acolytes disappear over the hill, crushing the juice from our dreams. We're about to be placed in a van and hauled back to the starting line, my hint's test run of failure. On Monday, I'll be back on the commuter train, getting to work again. Just like those Bordeaux wines, I'll be confined in a classification that's impossible to break out of. My mind flashes to Jefferson. Am I really going to be leaving them so soon? And I talk about the young man who asked Jefferson for advice from Bordeaux. Consider carefully, Jefferson counseled in a return letter. The young man had to find his own path to durable happiness. It won't be easy. It will certainly involve hard work. This is not a world in which heaven rains riches into any hand that will open itself, Jefferson wrote. Whichever of these courses you adopt, delay is loss of time. The sooner the race is begun, the sooner the prize will be obtained. Merde, I feel an almost electric jolt course through me. I'm not ready to abandon this race, this prize, this pursuit of happiness. Without a word, Leon and I rush forward, revolutionaries storming the barricades. We put pain out of mind. We charge up the hill, sweeping past the sweepers. On a runner's high, blisters and heat forgotten, we clock our fastest kilometer as the Grand Gironde River comes into sight. My cape flies crisp in the wind, our hearts pound in unison, our minds drag our exhausted bodies behind them. Allez, Liana, she's purple like Merlot and determined. Loud French music blares, people clap. The clock ticks 7 hours. We cross the line holding hands. We finish the marathon, and now the hard journey begins. So we thought the run was a success, and we decided to continue on with our trip. In another year, we went to Amsterdam. This is Amsterdam. I don't know if you've been. It's an incredible port city which has people from all over the world, goods from all over the world. And we visited on King's Day, which is this day each spring that celebrates the royal family, the House of Orange. And Jefferson was there in Amsterdam as well. Actually, today's the anniversary. He was there on March 12th, 1788. And that day, he bought an orange cockade to symbolize the royal house, because they were having kind of a somewhat similar festivity. And it was there in Amsterdam that I think Leanna and I really learned how to travel like Jefferson. So in his guidebook, he set out all these hints, these travel tips, and a lot of them, I think, stand the test of time today. So the first one is when you arrive in a place, buy a map, buy a guidebook, so get the information you're going to need, And then the next thing he wanted you to do is to go to the highest place in town. So it could be a church steeple, a city wall, whatever, and look down so you get an aerial view, and you can kind of start to understand how the city works and how it fits together, kind of like you might get from a Google Earth satellite map today. And from there, he thought you should go out and, as he put it, gulp down culture. So spend a day and go see what you want to see in this place. And in effect, carpe diem, think to yourself, you may never come back here again. So if there's something you really want to do, you should go out there and do it. But also find balance, because you can't do it all. And if you try to see everything in a museum, it's just going to burden your mind, as he put it. So do the essentials, what matters to you, but don't try to do everything. And then, once you've gotten the sights out of the way, go out there and learn about the place and meet people. He really wanted travelers to do more than, to see the big landmarks, but actually engage with people. He said, go to markets. That's a great place to actually, chat with people and see how people really live. Go to taverns. And he even said, drink local. Because if you get, he said, foreign wine is probably just going to be adulterated and overpriced. Just drink what everybody else is drinking in the tavern. And, so learn about the place. But also, Jefferson wrote in a letter, travel, even as you're learning about other places, it's the ideal time to learn about yourself as well. He wrote a letter from the south of France when he was in an inn, and he said, basically, everything he had at the time was just in these 2 suitcases, and he was never happier. He just felt like, here he was, he could just be in his hotel room, and it's just a time for reflection, a time for contemplation. So we continued on to have many other adventures. We explored landscape gardens in England. This is Stowe Gardens, which might have been Jefferson's favorite over there. English gardens were basically the only thing he liked in England. And he learned all about the landscaping and brought ideas back home to Monticello. So if you visit Monticello today, you can still see some of his landscaping ideas that he learned over in Europe and in England especially. So the base of the mountain in Monticello was left as wild woods. But then at the top of the mountain, it's pastures. So it's a contrast. And then you have the sweeping vista out looking west over what Jefferson called the workhouse of nature. So it was all part of, there's a message in there, I think, about both the grandeur of nature, but also about taming it. And we learned other things as well. I think, for sure, our favorite trip as a family was to Italy. So Jefferson in Italy wrote that he was on a continued feast. And here we are. This is in a small artisanal pasta factory in Gragnano, which is near Naples. And Jefferson got from Naples a macaroni maker, which he would bring back to America and would use to popularize macaroni when he was in the president's house. But there was another, maybe even more dramatic story that happened when Jefferson was in Italy. He became a rice smuggler. So in the northwest of Italy, in the Piedmont region, they had this special variety of rice that wasn't grown in the U.S. And Jefferson went there in person. He tried it. He realized he just had to have it. But there was a catch there, which was that the kingdom in the Piedmont of Italy prohibited the exportation of this rice in its unprocessed form. They didn't want competition. And the penalty was the death penalty. But Jefferson was not deterred. He stuffed his pockets full of this rice, and he made his way over the Alps. Spoiler, he wasn't caught and executed. But he got his rice back, and the planters actually didn't even like it. So they asked him to stop sending him the rice. And then this is another subject that we explored, science, natural history. So that was very important to Jefferson. As he was traveling throughout Europe, he was always making observations on the climate. In fact, he traveled with a thermometer, but he also, after his thermometer broke, he started taking notations in terms of when did almond trees bloom, when did apple trees blossom. He was trying to understand the climate of different parts of Europe and compare it to America. He was really ahead of his time. He thought it was very important to chart climate and even realize that humans were affecting climate. But one of the things that he was very interested in was the practical side of science. Jefferson wrote that science never appears so beautiful as when applied to the uses of human life. And he particularly applied science to fisheries and to whaling. These were big industries for America at the time, and that was part of his role as an ambassador, was to promote American fishing and whaling products. So he did a lot of studying in the seaports of France in terms of how fishing worked. So this is me in an auction house, at a fish auction in Brittany. But then we move on to probably Jefferson's favorite subject as he was traveling. And I'm going to have one more giveaway, and this is a tough one. Can anybody recognize what this building is, what this drawing? Yes. It's exactly right. So come up here and get your map afterwards. That's the first Monticello. So this is how he designed his house before he went to Europe. And if you've seen Monticello, if you've seen a nickel, you know that what we know of Monticello looks nothing like that. This is very boxy. All these porticos, there's really not much flow to the building. Basically because Jefferson hadn't seen buildings like this. He was designing everything from books. So he got designs from Palladio, the great Renaissance architect, and he basically mashed two of them together to come up with his first house. But things changed when he got to France. He saw a lot of Roman classical buildings as he traveled, but then in France, he encountered neoclassical architecture, which he really fell in love with. So this was Jefferson's favorite building in all of Europe. He said he was violently smitten with it. It's the Hotel de Salm, which is still there. It's on the left bank, right next to the Seine, not too far from the Eiffel Tower. And Jefferson's home, we can stay back. Jefferson's home was on the Champs-Élysées, just across the river from it. And this building was basically being constructed while Jefferson was in Paris the same year. So he would go out there, he'd sat up on a lawn chair and just watch it being built. And he wrote in a letter that he would get a neck ache as he just craned his neck trying to see every last detail. But he took all these ideas back from the Hotel de Salm. You can tell this looks a lot more like Monticello than that first drawing does. So he's got the dome, first of all. He took the idea of skylights from the Hotel de Salm. And also the French neoclassical architecture, it wasn't about being ostentatious. They were looking for harmony and elegance and a sense of flow. And they didn't, for example, the Hotel de Salm is 3 stories. It needed to appear as 1 story. And Jefferson took that idea back to Monticello. So I think very cleverly, he hid the 3rd story behind a balustrade. And he had the 2nd story windows be placed very low, so they basically looked like they were part of the first floor. So he had all these little tricks that he came back with from Europe, which is why Monticello looks so cozy today. And then the other thing he found in Europe was the building materials. So here we are in Carrara, Italy, which is kind of a death-defying trip that we took to the top of this mountain. This is where the best marble in maybe the world comes from. It's where Michelangelo got his marble. And when these young men that were following the guide back in 1788 went there, Jefferson wrote them a letter and asked them to commission a piece in Carrara. He wanted a marble chimney piece made from Monticello, so they got that for him. So Jefferson, he came back home and redesigned Monticello. So he had, he used marble, but very sparingly. He realized that the best building material back in Virginia, what do we have in Virginia? Red clay. So bricks became the kind of a signature part of his architecture. But he took all these ideas from both Palladio, from the buildings he saw in Paris, and he turned them over and he made them his own. So this is probably Jefferson's the most important cultural contribution that came from his travels, was spreading neoclassical architecture. If you leave politics and prose and walk around downtown DC, you're going to see all this architecture that looks kind of like Monticello. So Jefferson has as much to do with that, I think, as any person. But there was one thing that Jefferson never talked about in his guidebook. He talked about very, very sparingly in his letters. And of course, it's slavery. And this subject really came home to me as I did the journeys, but particularly as I looked into architecture, when I realized that, came back to see his buildings in Virginia. And I realized that when you say Jefferson built this building, he wasn't building any of these buildings. They were being built by enslaved African Americans. Jefferson owned over 600 people in his lifetime, and he only freed 10. So, of course, I knew this. We all know Jefferson's a slave owner, and I saw this as kind of a disappointing side of his character. But at the beginning of his travels, I thought, well, this is not necessarily going to be my biggest focus of research. I'm looking at Jefferson the traveler. But I realized you really can't. You can't separate the two because slavery was part of everything Jefferson did. And as I learned about all these projects he was engaged with, architecture, gardening, planting the rice, it was enslaved people who he intended to carry out these projects in all the cases. And even the money that Jefferson needed for his travels, for his lifestyles, it mostly came from his role as a slave owner. It was the tobacco being picked by enslaved people at Monticello and his other plantations that that gave Jefferson the means to do all this. So it really it left me thinking harder and thinking more critically about Jefferson, and I think a fact that was just so bitter to swallow as I was researching basically everything he did in the 1780s. In 1785, Jefferson's been in France for a year. He's running low on funds. He authorized his overseer at Monticello to sell 31 people. So 31 people were put on the auction block, but Jefferson said, don't put my name on it, put it under your name. So it's a subject that Jefferson didn't want to be associated with, but it's part and parcel of who he was. And I think, sadly, it was in this time in Paris that Jefferson walked back his strong stance on emancipation. He had been pushing for gradual emancipation in Virginia, in the Congress, and he didn't after Paris, after he became just even deeper in debt. He never did again. So these were difficult things to understand and to think about Jefferson, and left me thinking about him in a new light, and frankly about myself as I kind of interrogated myself more too, with family, having been in Virginia for centuries, to think about these subjects and think about how we haven't lived up to, Jefferson didn't live up to his ideals, and we're still trying hard to do so today. So this is a picture of Isaac Granger, who was a tinsmith and a blacksmith at Monticello. And I think learning about Jefferson, I think one positive thing, though, and I almost gave up on this project. I became so kind of deeply saddened by Jefferson. But ultimately, I kind of went off the script, and I started doing some travels that had nothing to do with hints to Americans traveling in Europe, and instead explored the lives of enslaved people who lived on Monticello and kind of shared this mountain. So this is the Reverend Peter Fawcett, and I found this to be just a really rich and rewarding thing for me to learn about as well, the paths to freedom that some people managed to take from Monticello. So Peter Fawcett, he was a member of the Hemings family, even though his last name wasn't Hemings. He was a great-nephew of Sally Hemings and also of her brother, of course, James Hemings, both of whom were in Paris. And Peter grew up, the Hemings family was a little more privileged than some other families, enslaved families at Monticello. They weren't doing hard labor like some, but he had a very rude awakening when Jefferson died. Jefferson died in 1826, deeply in debt, and his estate auctioned off 130 people and broke up families, including that of the Fawcetts. So Peter was only 11, and his father was one of the 10 people who were freed, but Peter wasn't. He was sold to a new white master who was particularly cruel, who whipped him, who forbade him from reading. And he tried to escape and was caught and brought back. So he just had a really hard time and a lot of suffering until finally his father, Joe, who was a blacksmith, a freed blacksmith at this time in Charlottesville, he managed to raise enough money from his own work, from that of friends, to purchase his son's freedom. And they all then moved to Ohio. So it was in Cincinnati that Peter Fawcett became a minister. He worked on the Underground Railroad. He had a successful catering business. And he returned to Monticello. So during this time, the Levy family, a Jewish family that were big admirers of Jefferson for his commitment to religious freedom, they bought Monticello and opened it up as a bit of a shrine, let the public in. And they heard of Peter Fawcett's story, and he was invited back to Monticello. So in 1900, at the age of 85, he returned. He had been sold on the West Lawn of Monticello at auction, but he returned as an older man walking through the front door of Monticello. So, the journey taught me a lot about Jefferson. It made me realize that I think he really should be remembered. And it's also a way, by remembering him, of remembering all of these enslaved people who had their own lives and own journeys completely apart from him. But, it taught me, I think, about where he set out ideals for us, and he often failed to live up to them. But I also still came away from these trips, I think, admiring some parts of Jefferson, of his commitment to religious freedom, to science, the kind of the part of him that was forward thinking, and then actually acted on those beliefs. So there's a lot I think there's a lot I learned, and as a person, about myself, about Jefferson from the trip. But one last note before I take your questions. There's one other thing Jefferson also did around this time, which was write a book himself. So Jefferson wrote the only published full-length book in his career. He wrote this and published it in Paris in 1787. It was called Notes on the State of Virginia. And so he sent a copy of it. He was rushing off on this big trip that I've talked about to the south of France and Italy. So the day before he left, he finally finished. He was writing feverishly, and he sent his manuscript off to the publisher. And he wrote to the publisher, "I will pray you to print this precisely as it is, without additions, alterations, preface, or anything else but what is there." So it's kind of the cry of authors from all time. And his publisher in London assured him he would print it perfectly, and he'd send out advertisements all over England and Scotland, and he said he'd work with booksellers in America. And Jefferson wrote back when he came back from his trip and said, "I'm exceedingly obliged to you for the trouble you've taken with the bookseller for the sale of my book." So here, I wanted to say, this is the launch of the book. I wanted to say thank you to all of you, whether you've been on this journey for a long time or you just wandered in off the street. You're still part of this, so thanks for coming. And I am also exceedingly obliged, as Jefferson would put it, to many of you, to my wonderful agent, Amanda Jane, who's here, to the great editors I have at Sourcebooks, Anna Michaels and Jenna Jankowski. They did not put any bad additions or alterations in. I'm sure Jefferson would have just loved working with them. And Madeline Brown at Sourcebooks. Some fellow writers, there's several of them are here. Thank you so much, Tim Grove, for all your help. Thank you, Matina Calliope. You guys were essential to this writing process. And then to all the family members who went on the trip with me. Thank you to my parents, Carl and Judy, to my kids, Miranda and Nico, who learned so much. And then, of course, thank you to my wife, Liana. Well, thank you all. All right, I guess we'll take some questions.
Thank you so much. What a warm way to spend a Saturday evening. Folks, in about 2 seconds, I'm going to be coming to collect any note cards that you completed before the event. Before I do that, I do have an initial question to start. Thank you for walking us through history. I'm now going to rewind us all the way back to the beginning, if you will. I am curious, of these 8 values that Jefferson wrote down, I'm fascinated. Do you think that in contemporary America, we are valuing some over others, opposed to Jefferson's ideas, or do they line up the same? And, if you will indulge us, do you think we could shift our attention more towards some rather than others? I'm curious on your perspective. As the author digs into that, if you have note cards, please hold them up. I will come scurry and collect them.
Well, that's a very interesting question. So a couple of the subjects you might be surprised to find in there today. Landscape gardens, aren't Jefferson saw them as a major art form, much more so perhaps than we do today. So that's one that we may not, as a traveler, you may not think of as much. But Jefferson loved landscaping. It was all the rage in the late 1700s. And he thought this was a great subject for Americans to engage with. We have all this nature. He said, just cut out all the super abundant plants and there's your garden. It's a little harder than that. But, gardens, obviously royal courts, there's not as much monarchy today, although there's plenty of despotism. So, it's an interesting mix. I think it is still a pretty good list of subjects, including on manufacturing, because Jefferson often gets this rap that he hated factories. That was Alexander Hamilton, and Jefferson was just all about agriculture. It turns out to be a lot more nuanced, and Jefferson was interested in mechanical arts. He just wasn't convinced that America was ready to engage with them to that extent yet. Of course, then came the Industrial Revolution. So, on the whole, I think it's an interesting mix of both looking at how people lived, because by the life of the common people, he really wanted to almost be a proto-sociologist. He wanted to see how did the laws of different countries affect how people lived. So he wanted to basically say, as you travel, see if people seem prosperous, if they seem free, and then crosswalk that with the kind of government they had. So, that's a really interesting thing to think about as you're traveling. So it's a mix of both harder subjects like politics and cultural subjects and economic subjects. So it was plenty for us to think about, I think, as we traveled.
Thank you. Before we throw to audience Q&A, and we might have time for extra questions if you should think of them, one more thing I'm struck by is the image of drinking wine while running, panting out of breath. There's something about the idea of Jefferson which holds two ideas that seem to contrast each other, which is we think of wine, we think of refinery, we think of maybe fine taste, but Jefferson was also someone who really valued sciences and doing the work and sort of this rugged, outdoors, great frontiers image that we think about. How did you find traveling that those things were balanced? And I'm just curious, maybe I'm being vague here, but so many of us think about retreat as in either we're going to go total luxury or I'm going to rough it and I'm going to camp. And so I'm wondering, how did you find I can find time for something refined and so sensory in the midst that I'm sweating and running and traveling and dealing with some of the grosser, more, rotund parts of travel, if you will?
Sure. Well, I'm not saying it's the ideal way to drink Bordeaux wines, is drinking them as you run a marathon, but it was kind of the only option, I think, that we saw.
Tell them about the night before.
That's the night before. There's a huge party that all these runners went to at a chateau where they're just serving up all this Bordeaux wine. So, yeah, not everybody was in fine running form the next morning. And, it is interesting. Yeah, Jefferson, he loved kind of what you would think of this high culture, these fine wines, but he did want what he thought to have what was the best in culture, but he also did want this to be accessible, and so he would serve wine after dinner. He would have something else in dinner, and then the enslaved people would clear away the food, put linens out, and then bring out the wine. So the idea was it was to be appreciated then at the very end. But he was open to all sorts of wine, too, which I thought was interesting. He started just, blowing through his budget, buying Burgundies and Bordeauxs. As he got deeper into debt, he started looking for what he called everyday wines. So he went all over, got wines from the south of France. He brought Chianti into America. So he's looking for other types of wine, too. And, of course, he tried to grow it kind of unsuccessfully at Monticello. But so for him, I think he just had a range. He just basically wanted people to appreciate, in this case, wine. And for him, it was a sense of place, too, because even as an old man, he was still talking about his trips to Europe. And he would serve wines from there. And he would be, diners would talk about how he was associating wines with different places. So I think that was an interesting connection for him.
Thank you. I'm going to throw to some audience questions. This one comes from Ethan, who asks, how long did it take to write and research this book?
Well, it took a long time, is the short answer. It took probably longer than it had to. So we did the travels over an 8-year period. So this is my first book, so it took a lot of time to just learn how to write and to understand the writing process. But a lot of the writing was done, really the bulk of the final draft was done during the pandemic. And so it can take a while, but you just keep at it.
Did any of your writing change due to the pandemic? A lot of authors have talked about, I was thinking in different terms when the pandemic hit. Did that affect the writing of the book at all?
It was hard. Obviously, in the pandemic, you've got a lot harder things to think about than, these pursuits like that. It's about what we're all going through. So it was difficult to adjust. And just on a very micro level, it was hard for me because I love to write in cafes, and I wrote everything up to then in coffee houses. All of a sudden, they're all closed. I didn't know what to do until I was just at a loss until Liana opened up a cafe on our porch and brought me a nice little espresso. So then we were fine. But they did throw a wrench into things. So as you read the book, you'll see we had planned for one big last trip in the summer of 2020 to tie everything together, and that was impossible. So we had to improvise. So if you make it to the end, you'll see what we did instead.
A cliffhanger. A follow-up to the writing and research question. What's the most interesting thing you learned about Jefferson in your travels? That's also from Ethan.
Well, thank you, Ethan. That's a good question, too. One of the things I didn't know about is the story of Jefferson and the giant moose. So there was this naturalist in Paris, the Comte de Buffon, who was the most famous natural historian of his day. But he kind of latched onto this weird theory that American climate was cool and damp and had all these noxious vapors and was terrible for people and animals and plants and everything. And everything was inferior to what you could find in Europe. And this, of course, incensed Jefferson. So he actually, from Paris, he commissioned a moose to be sent over to him. So he had actually a Revolutionary War general go out on a hunting party in New Hampshire. They killed a moose and they brought it back, but it was this kind of all these comic mishaps. The moose was it was left on the dock in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The ship didn't take it, so it kept decomposing and rotting. And finally, the moose arrived in Paris, and Jefferson brought it over to Buffon and said, "Look, you thought the moose was the same as the European reindeer, but you can actually fit an entire reindeer underneath. You can walk underneath the moose." And Buffon still was not impressed, but that was a fun story, and I have a little moose adventure in Paris as well.
A final note card question before we throw it open for a few more as we have time. An attendee writes, I will be in Charlottesville for 3 weeks, and France and Switzerland, it looks like, for 3 months this summer. What should I do and see?
Take me with you, first of all. So that's great. There is so much to see and do in all of those places. In Charlottesville, obviously, you can visit Monticello. You can see a lot of Jefferson's architecture at the University of Virginia, which is the passion project of his old age. And during the pandemic, they've opened now a memorial to enslaved laborers near the rotunda at the University of Virginia, which is also very moving. So there's a lot to see there. I would also recommend, if you have a lot of time, going down to Poplar Forest near Lynchburg, Jefferson's second home. But all over France and Switzerland, you can follow a lot of his trail. I've got some of it on the map. I've got, actually at my website, I've started to put some very practical tips because we get asked all the time, literally just tell us where you went and we want to go to those places too. So you can go, it's jeffersontravels.com. I've got some practical tips there. But Jefferson never made it to Switzerland, but he put it on his itinerary of places to go. And There's some beautiful things to see in Geneva that the young men who were following the guide back there saw. So anyway, there's so much to see. And then down from Switzerland, not very far over the Alps, is Milan. And then, okay, let me put it in one last plug, because I literally could be up here for an hour telling you places to go. But a place in the Alps called Seorge, that might have been the most magical place our family went to. We never would have gone to it if it hadn't been on this guidebook. It's this tiny little village. It's basically, Jefferson wrote that it looks like it's clinging to a mountaintop. So it's on such a steep cliff that houses go, they're all made out of stone, and they go up for 3 stories. You have different families living on different stories. So you feel, the cliche, but you definitely feel like you've gone back to some place out of time, and I would absolutely recommend going there.
A few questions hot off the presses. An attendee writes, the world and Europe have changed a lot in 200 years. Having said that, what you see across Europe, is it the same essence that you think was interesting or inspiring to Jefferson? Were some things, maybe this is not their words, but were some things modernized, or do you think you're getting the authenticity there?
Wow, yeah, there's a lot to think about in that question. So I think the tourism industry really started around this time. It started in the 18th century, the Grand Tour. This was young aristocratic males primarily were going on these great trips across Europe and seeing the sights. So it was right at Jefferson's time that professional guides started popping up. In Rome, you could hire a guide for the day. Guidebooks started being published. So you can feed into that, obviously, which I think is a continuation of what Jefferson saw. He was there. He was being a tourist. But of course, he also wanted to see how people lived. And so much has changed over Europe. They've had many difficult moments in their history. Some things have radically changed. So Germany was not one state when Jefferson went there, and neither was Italy. There were all collections of states. One country that went through just traumatic change was France. Jefferson was there at the very beginning of the French Revolution. I write about this a bit in the book, about how behind the scenes, he helped Lafayette actually start the revolution. It was the moderate faction. This is way before all the guillotines. But France has transformed into a republic. It started that just as Jefferson was there. So some things have changed quite a bit. I suppose of all of our different travels, going to the English gardens and all these estates, it felt like maybe they hadn't changed quite as much. Going to places like Blenheim and Stowe and all, you definitely knew you were seeing some things exactly as Jefferson saw it.
And lastly, who did Jefferson travel with in Europe? Did he have an entourage? Which attendee writing entourage, love the use of that word.
So he traveled. First of all, he did not travel with enslaved people as he went around in Europe, as he did back home. He would always have an enslaved servant come and drive his carriage. He didn't in Europe. I think in effect, he was often trying to hide the connection to slavery. He traveled as a private person. He had a diplomatic passport, but he didn't use it on these trips. He really wanted to just get out there. He wouldn't tell anybody he was the ambassador to France. He really wanted to connect with people at a one-on-one level. So his idea was to go to different cities and basically hire a servant, because that's what aristocratic people had. They had their servants. And so he would do that in different places. And he actually had one on his longest trip. He got along so well with this valet that he just kept him engaged for the entire trip. But he would travel with his own carriage, and he would switch out the horses every 10 or 12 miles or so along the way. That's not something you can do today. But one thing I really did appreciate was just the speed at which Jefferson was traveling, which was very slow. So it was a way to really take in the sights and I think, and appreciate things. I think that's really important no matter how you do it when you travel.
Thank you for that. Before we begin to wrap up, I'm told we have a special guest who would like to pop up.
So I haven't prepared a speech. I haven't written down anything, but as watching Dad's presentation, it just kind of appeared to me like how much this book has influenced all of our lives, all of the Baxter's lives. And I'd just like to say a few words. So Dad, I think we've all been a part of this journey, but I think I've definitely been the one who's been there from the beginning. The very first trip we did, unofficial Baxter travel, was not to France or to Italy. It was actually to Mount Vernon to see some animals. And it was just Dad and I, and he pushed me around in a stroller. I was 2 years old or something. And Nico wasn't even alive yet. And that kind of puts stuff in perspective. But just listening to the presentation, it kind of made me realize like how much of my own life was influenced, not just all of us as a family. So he talked about Seyorge. I've even I drafted my own book, influenced my dad heavily, about Seyorge and about a romance story that happened there. It's not very successful, but I've also developed a love of cooking after the Italy trip. I love pasta. It's my favorite food. Every single day in Italy, we would eat this spaghetti carbonara, and we're still trying to put together the ingredients to make it again today. And also, it's always just been a part of my life. So whenever people ask about my parents and I ask about Dad, I always first say he's writing a book. And it's always it's not always a book, it's always the book. And so during the pandemic, after online school, in masks, because we were super cautious, we would walk around the neighborhood and we would talk for an hour or two just about our books. And Dad's always had his book, but it's always mostly been me introducing and reintroducing about 7 different books, each one of them unsuccessful. I'm even writing a history book now about ancient Rome. And after all this, I just have to say thanks, Dad, because you've influenced so much of my life.
Same as the things. I have the same feeling as the female gremlin as the male gremlin. This trip, it changed me a lot. Definitely, the most changing moment of this trip had to be our final trip to Monticello. It was on our final trip period after the finale of the book. But it really changed me on how, in American history, you'd like to think of our founding fathers as angels, as heroes that are uncorrupted. They're our American gods. We treat George Washington like our Zeus, our father of America. And after my visit in Monticello, I really realized these are people who are very flawed, very flawed figures, like Thomas Jefferson. As I actually said in the book, my former naive self changed a bit, as I said in the line, Jefferson is no longer my favorite founding father. I used to love Jefferson as much as my father did. In the book, I even tried to do a project before COVID-19 happened on Jefferson. But, alas, COVID-19 happened. But this really changed my perspective on how flawed our heroes are and how flawed our gods are. So so Dad's book really helped change my thought from just treating our people like gods into treating them as corrupted figures. So I'd really like to thank my father for this. I'd like to thank Dad for this. I'd like to thank the adult
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I can't follow that. I'd like to, though, say on behalf of Politics and Prose, I look forward to hearing from the agents and publicists from all members of the Baxter family as they continue to write and travel. Can we have one last round of applause for author Derek Baxter in Pursuit of Jefferson? We thank authors and all of you from the bottom of our hearts. We can't continue to host these types of events without your patronage and support. Please grab your signed copies of Pursuit of Jefferson to hear what happened, that cliffhanger family vacation. We have them for you behind the registers as you head out. A final reminder, please take responsibility for the chair you are sitting in. As you stand, please fold it up. Put it against the wall to your right. And from all of us here, please stay safe, stay strong, and